Thank you so much for coming to the International Institute for Strategic Studies today. My name is Layat Mohsin. I'm the Assistant Research Analyst for Middle East and North Africa in the Conflict, Security and Development Programme. To my right is Emil Hikayem, Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, and to my right is Zainab Olyabek, also Assistant Research Analyst for Middle East and North Africa. This event is part of our monthly conflict briefing series where we hone in on one of the ongoing conflicts around the world and assess its current state, and it is a very timely one this month, being Iraq. As everyone must be aware, Iraq has had a week of intense protests, and given the gravity of this round of protests, is particularly important that we address what is going on. So, on the issue of protests, Emil, could you walk us through what is currently taking place, the structural issues, and how you see them turning out?
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. We shouldn't be too surprised about what happened last week. Certainly, we should be surprised about the lethality of the incidents in Baghdad and throughout the southern part of Iraq. But protests have been a feature of Iraqi politics for the past few years. Certainly, the period after the defeat of ISIS has led to optimism about the prospect for stabilization, certainly optimism that at times was warranted. But it has also refocused attention on the lingering structural issues that plague Iraq. And those protests, we've seen them in previous years. Some of them, many of them had a peaceful character. Some of them did degenerate in violence at times. The protests of Basra come to mind, but we also saw in Baghdad in previous years. For instance, at one time, protesters made it into the so-called green zone, or the thing, all the way into government buildings. So, what's different here is really the size of the protests, and for the first time, the lethality, the very brutal response of the security forces there. All this tells us a few things. I mean, Iraq has a very fragmented political scene. It has had this since 2003. But the elections last year show us to what extent it is fragmented. And we're just showing you behind the breakdown in parliament after the elections. We could tell how fragmented this was, in part of how protracted the discussions over the formation of the government have been. We can tell the fragmentation of the political scene by the choice of the president and the prime minister, who, while quite competent and internationally recognized, tend to be politically weak inside Iraq. So it tells you that actually the system has settled for relatively weaker figures who are not necessarily able to control the street, are not necessarily able to control political parties, and just make sure that policy reforms are on track. Now, the protests exist in part because Iraq has an open political space. There's space for contestation. There's a space for civil society. There's a space for for media. But also, this means that you also have an incentive for escalation. You have an incentive for political parties to toughen their stand. I think that what's interesting in the recent case is the differentiation on issues between the various parties, right? It's not just about anger on the street, although it's a lot about anger on the street. It's also about different political parties identifying what the top issues are and proposing, perhaps not necessarily viable ideas, but still different ideas about how to go ahead. Now, the interesting thing about those protests as well, I'm not going to spend too much time about what the protesters want. They want jobs, they want better opportunity, they want cleaner water, the problems are structural. But what they are contesting fundamentally is the post-2003 political order, Muhassasa Siyasiyya, that really was enshrined in the Constitution in 2005 and later on. And that's not going to go away. But this protest movement is not strong enough, I think, at this point, to really force a reform of that political order. There are way too many political parties and militias invested in the order as it is. And the order as it is actually reinforces the structural problems of the country. Sorry for bringing it to Lebanon. I'm Lebanese, so Lebanon explains everything. It's quite similar to the Lebanese system. I don't want to push the analogy too far, but where it's a weak political system at the same time, because it produces enough benefits to a large variety of actors, no one has an interest in wholesale, genuine reform. Would end by saying just a couple things that were quite striking. We saw very different responses to the protest across the political spectrum. The president and the prime minister had actually a very mature response to that. They acknowledge the problems. They know it's about socio-economic issues. They haven't tried to tarnish the protesters. Of course, they carry responsibility for the violent action of the security forces. But the response was still a measured one. It's not necessarily a realistic one. The prime minister and others have alluded to more public sector jobs. Well, Iraq has a bloated bureaucracy. I'm not sure this is the way down. So much depends on the price of oil, right? I mean, a lot of Iraq's aspirations depend on where that price is, and so on. So but compare this to, for instance, the National Security Advisor, Falih al-Fayyad, who actually blamed the protesters on conspiracies, that there were elements and they create disorder and so on. Blaming unknown parties for that. So two very different discourse to that. And then the political parties. Some of them, including Muqtada Sadr and others, have a populist streak to them. And so they have tried to court at least the sympathy of the protesters. Muqtada Sadr had done this in the past at various juncture. So he has one foot in government, one foot outside government, and he's playing on that. Other political factions have preferred not to take a stand or to actually criticize the protesters, because they see them as a challenge to the very structure that they benefit from. So this is going to be a feature of the Iraqi political landscape for years to come. There doesn't seem to be, a clear policy response. Iraq has done some progress, but clearly not enough for a large segment of the population that feels, on the losing end these days.
Sure. Thank you so much, Emil. Obviously, part of the broader question about Iraq's stability and the future of its security revolves around the debate on the Hashd al-Sha'bi, or the popular mobilization units. And for that, I'd like to turn to Zainab and really try and understand what are the domestic debates that are currently taking place on the PMUs and their role within the country.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Dia. Before delving into the debate surrounding the role of the popular mobilization units, or the PMUs, in Iraq, it's important to first set some context. Then I'll discuss the domestic debate taking place, and then I'll address the Prime Minister's July 2019 decree. Formed in 2014, the umbrella organisation of the Popular Mobilisation Units brought together approximately 50 paramilitary units, both new and pre-existing, under the banner of the PMU with the purpose of fighting ISIS and recapturing territory for the Iraqi state. Units within the PMU proved vital in the fight against ISIS and successfully defeated them in several areas of Iraq. However, with the territorial defeat of ISIS in 2017, we witnessed a move towards a more politicized, more factional, and more competitive PMU. Units became more involved in domestic politics and economics, diversifying their role and not limiting themselves to security provision. This is most evident in the formation of the Fatah Alliance, a political bloc bringing together several units and important figures within the PMU. This includes Badr Organization, headed by Hadi Al-Amiri, Asab Ahl Al-Haq, led by Qais Al-Khazali, and Katab Hezbollah, led by Abu Mahdi Al-Muhandis. As you can see there, in green is the Fatah Alliance. This alliance came second in the 2018 elections, earning 48 seats in parliament, coming second only to Muqtada Sadr's Sa'irun alliance. Some units within the PMU even have control over certain border checkpoints, allowing them to collect taxes and tariffs on goods transported along borders. This includes the Safra border crossing into the Kurdistan region of Iraq, controlled by the Badr organization. Of course, not all units within the Popular Mobilization units are as actively involved in domestic politics and economics as I outlined, but their outlook and perception of the role of the PMU differs per unit. Even amongst those that are involved in politics, there are various differences between them, and they are often found competing against one another for power and influence. Each group looks out for its own interests and uses the devices available to them for that end. Now I'll move on to discuss the debate on what the PMU should look like in the Iraqi system. So the question on the role of the paramilitary units is not new to Iraq, and it didn't emerge alongside the introduction of the PMU in 2014. It has been a discussion occurring since 2003, with different prime ministers approaching the issue in different ways. With reference to the Popular Mobilization units in particular, there have been two dominant strands in the debate on the future role of the PMU within Iraq. The first advocates for the autonomy of the units, functioning alongside the army as a separate entity rather than as part of it. This follows the notion that security provision would be more effective if the groups are left to their own devices and operate independently rather than under a state ministry. This would follow the model similar to the IRGC, in which the PMU would cooperate with the army but not be under the same command and control. Those typically associated with this line of argument are Iran-allied groups, particularly Badr organization, and influential figures within the same camp. The second position within this debate calls for the integration of units within the PMU into either the armed forces under the purview of the Ministry of Defense or into the Federal Police and the Ministry of Interior. This would serve two main purposes. First, it would unify the forces within state institutions, all answering to the Commander-in-Chief, rather than prioritizing other allegiances. Second, it would address factionalism and competition between and within security forces and the PMU, forming a consolidated and consequently more effective security force. This would require units within the PMU to change their uniforms, remove their flags, and give up their autonomous command and control. This view is typically supported by the Prime Minister, the Iraqi Prime Minister, Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Sistani and Muqtada al-Sadr, and their respective PMU units. When Haider al-Abadi came into power in 2014, he was faced with the PMUs organized and theoretically controlled by the Popular Mobilization Commission, an entity under the Prime Minister's office, which his predecessor Nouri al-Maliki had introduced. But while this was meant to bring the units under the control of the Prime Minister, the reality was different. Groups were more or less autonomous and had their own systems of command and control, separate from the government that did not answer to the Commander-in-Chief. Abadi initially accepted the status quo, but strived to take some control and direct the units towards integration in an effort to unify his forces. In July 2016, Abadi passed Executive Order 91, and then in November 2016, the Iraqi Parliament passed the law of the Popular Mobilization Commission, both of which recognized the PMU as an independent military formation as part of the Iraqi armed forces and linked to the Commander-in-Chief. This allowed the PMU to be recognized as a legitimate armed entity within the National Security Council, rather than within and subservient to the Ministry of Defense. However, his main goal, Abadi's main goal, was to formally integrate the PMU into the army or the federal police, which he attempted but failed to do with his decree in March 2018. Now, there we go. This leads us to the current Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi's July 2019 decree, which also called for the integration of all PMU units into the army or federal police. The decree stated that all names of the PMU groups must be given up and replaced with military designations. and that all economic offices, checkpoints, or presences established must be ceased and closed. Those that did not wish to do so should either disband or formally transition into political parties. For these requirements, he gave a deadline of July 31st. Now, Chairman of the Popular Mobilization Commission, Falh al-Fayyad, stated that a couple of economic offices had been closed, but the most powerful units are yet to integrate into the state forces or into the federal police. Responses of the PMU units to the decree reflect the fragmented and competitive nature of the PMUs. Now, one would expect Iran-allied groups to be opposed to the decree, but we see more diversity within these blocs that reflects each group's own interests. Saraya al-Salam, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, and Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba supported the decree and the decision to integrate in the armed forces, despite the fact that the former is Sadr's group and the latter two are supported by Iran. By integrating into state forces, these groups would likely gain more power and legitimacy by having access to the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior. On the other hand, Badr organization has criticized the decision as they already have access to the Ministry of Interior as a source of power and legitimacy. In fact, the integration of other units within the PMU could be seen as a threat to Badr, as they would then have to compete for power and influence with other factions within the Ministry of Interior. The competition and factionalism within the PMU both complicates and necessitates action on the position of the PMU within the Iraqi security structure. But it seems over the past few years at least that the Prime Minister has only been able to issue decrees without following those with a form of implementation.
Thank you very much, Zainab. Obviously, the question of the PMUs as it relates to Iraq's security is a matter that raises the topic of ISIS. And given how critical the PMUs were in that fight, could you tell us what the current state of the fight against ISIS looks like in Iraq?
Yes, of course, thank you. Since the loss of their territory in Iraq in 2017, ISIS has avoided major battlefield engagements and resorted to insurgency tactics similar to its earlier years. This is predominantly comprised of hit-and-run tactics and suicide attacks in the same areas that were once under its control, including the provinces of Anbar, particularly Jazeera Desert, Ninawa and the Makhmur Mountains, Diyala and the Hamreen Mountain Range, as well as areas of Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din. ISIS militants have gone into remote areas such as these deserts and mountain ranges, areas with rough terrain, with the intention of making it difficult for Iraqi security forces to counter them efficiently. The map behind me shows the clashes between ISIS and the Iraqi security forces in the first half of this year, which were concentrated in those areas that I mentioned. Evidently, the frequency of attacks is much lower compared to previous years, but the threat of militancy remains important for the stability of the Iraqi state. Rather than focusing on the number of attacks, we should pay more attention to the form in which the attacks take place and the targeting of their victims. Since ISIS adopted its insurgency strategy and tactics again over the last few years, their targets can be grouped into three. First, ISIS militants target members of the Iraqi security forces, including the army, the federal police, whose patrols and checkpoints are targeted in ambushes or hit-and-run attacks. Members of the popular mobilization units and the tribal mobilization units, as well as their families, are also seen to be victims and targets of ISIS attacks. Secondly, important local figures are targeted, including tribal leaders and governors of towns and cities. Thirdly, citizens are seen to be targets of ISIS attacks through car bombs or suicide attacks in cities including Mosul and Kirkuk. Even civilians that are believed to be cooperating with state forces against ISIS are seen as a concurrent target of their attack. This is an attempt on behalf of ISIS to show that although they no longer hold territory, they are still capable to inflict damage on people that matter to the Iraqi state. And Iraqi security forces have continued in their efforts to counter the threat that they face from ISIS, conducting military operations to clear the region in which the militants operate. However, they face a number of problems. Firstly, the forces were trained and equipped for years to conduct battlefield operations and defeat ISIS territorially. Now, facing an insurgency, security forces have found themselves ill-equipped for the specifics of conducting a counterinsurgency. Second, the remote areas in which ISIS cells exist, such as deserts and mountain regions, make it difficult for the already overstretched Iraqi security forces to clear and maintain those areas from militant presence. And thirdly, forces fighting militants are often divided. The Iraqi forces, including the army, the federal police, the counterterrorism service, and the popular mobilization units, often differ in their preferred method of fighting. While they do coordinate with one another and conduct military operations together, it's often disjointed, and cooperation is not as coherent as it could be, particularly between the counterterrorism forces and the popular mobilization units. While the fight against ISIS isn't as intense as it once was, it still remains a vital aspect that must be tackled in order to ensure security across Iraq.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for that very comprehensive overview of what the current fight against ISIS looks like. I guess the other side of the coin is how Iraq's role in the region is now changing, and the broader regional question of what Iraq looks like in this, ever-changing security landscape. So, Emil, could you talk us through how you see that playing out?
Well, one would think that Iraq has enough on its plate as it is, but you have to add another dimension, which is Iraq being caught in the US-Iran tensions as of late. Obviously, this has been a topic since 2003, but with the Trump administration essentially deciding to put massive pressure on Iran since May 2018, with the withdrawal of the JCPOA and the introduction of new sanctions, Iraq has been much more vulnerable to regional dynamics. And at several levels. I mean, first is the question of Iraq as a possible arena for a U.S.-Iran showdown. That Iranian aligned groups in Iraq would essentially do the bidding of Iran by targeting U.S. forces if there is a regional escalation, or Iraq being used by the U.S. to stage attacks against Iran or Iran's partners. And certainly, I think it was President Trump at one point, or I think Secretary Pompeo, at one point, who basically said, our strategy for Iraq includes using Iraq against Iran, and Iraqi officials just pushed back massively against this idea. So that's one aspect. The other aspect has to do with sanctions and pressure. And Iraq is dependent on energy imports from Iran. And so the issue of sanctions and sanction waivers has been on the topic. And I suspect there's a lot of Iraqi officials who just, hold their breath until the waiver, I suspect it's a paper, comes through. And then I think we have a breakdown of not this one yet, the number of waivers that have been issued in the the first line should be 9th November 2018, not 19. But a number of waivers since the reimposition of sanctions. Also questions about the use of Iraqi banks and others for Iranian trading and so on. So, if we can go back to this. So, since 2018, we saw a number of attacks on U.S. Presence and facilities in Iraq. We remember when Mike Pompeo rushed to Baghdad in May, and there was a partial drawdown at the U.S. Embassy. The consulate in Basra was closed a year ago as well. So, if you look at this map and the timeline, there is a sense of pressure. But I would say that, in fact, it hasn't been as bad as feared. And that's in part because the various actors don't necessarily have an interest in a showdown in Iraq. It may happen, but they don't necessarily have an interest. The Iraqi government has lobbied everyone and has talked to everyone to make sure that Iraq is not the scene of renewed fighting. The president and the prime minister and others have met with leaders of the PMUs a number of times to ask them not to play that game. Same thing with Iran. President Saleh and Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi have visited Iran, and President Rouhani came to Baghdad as well, and that was one of the main messages conveyed. The U.S. itself, despite the rhetoric of Mike Pompeo, Bolton, or whatever, has actually sought to preserve Iraq and not really play it too hard there. So it's quite telling that since May 2019, the attacks that Iran has conducted in the region have not been primarily in Iraq or against U.S. troops there and so on. Although there's one incident that did cause a lot of concern and confusion. The likely use of Iraqi territory for drone attacks against Saudi Arabia in 2019, which this incident plus, if you look at the next slide, alleged Israeli strikes in Iraq in the past year. For instance, Abu Mahdi Muhandis, the deputy commander of the PMU, but probably the real leader of the PMU, spoke a few months ago about the need for the Hashd, the PMU, to have its own air force, for instance, and that created a political storm in Iraq, because one, it showed the ambitions of the PMU. Second, there are real questions about Iraqi sovereignty, how you defend that. I mean, Israel hitting as deep into Iraqi territory. We knew that Israel was hitting hard inside Syria to prevent Iranian-aligned groups from building a military infrastructure there. Now Israel is making allegations that because Syria has not been as hospitable as Iran wanted to be, Iran is using more and more Iraq for storage of weaponry and prepositioning of weaponry. Look at the June 2018 and the August 2019 strikes on the border Qa'im with Syria. If you have followed what has happened in the past couple of years, there seems to be a continuity there. So the question is really, how does Iraq stay out of this tense game? I think that President Saleh and Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi really keep this at the top of the agenda, hope that things will diffuse. Iraqi officials at times have talked about them playing a mediation role. I think that's perhaps a bridge too far for Iraq. It's one thing to pass messages, but mediation, which is like an active role in helping the two sides resolve their differences, is probably too much for a weak government and a country that has many more issues to address. At the moment, it seems like regional war is not on the horizon. We're dealing with another one, Turkey versus PKK. The Middle East never cease to amaze. But in Iraq, at least at the moment, it feels like the various parties just understand what the stakes are and are not actively pursuing an escalation. Of course, this can change in a moment. The Iranians can decide to do that. The Americans can decide to do that. A local faction may decide to differentiate itself and conduct an operation just to provoke. It's still a troubled landscape.
Thank you very much, Emil. With that, I would like to turn to the audience for questions. Just a few points on housekeeping. Please introduce yourself, state your affiliation and name, and also please keep anything said to strictly a question, no comments. So I will start with the lady at the back, please. Sorry, could you just speak up a little bit? It's a bit hard.
Lizzie Hobbs, I'm a PhD researcher at LSE. There are still enormous numbers of IDPs in Iraq, and I just wondered what the political implications of that were. Does it affect voting coalitions?
Thank you very much. Zainab, would you like to address that question?
1.1?
I think Emil.
Well, there are real issues in terms of IDPs. You probably researched that, so you know this better than us. But it's quite complex. I mean, number one, I think the tempo of reconstruction isn't there. So what to return to is a big question when you read interviews with IDPs. Whether it's basic infrastructure, whether it's housing, whether it's schooling, health infrastructure, and so on. I think the optimistic view a couple years ago, ISIS is defeated, the international community rallies, big announcements in Kuwait and elsewhere, and so on, and then promises by the Iraqi government, they haven't materialized the way most people expected, right? I mean, you still see pictures from, the hospital in Ramadi and, large sections of Mosul and so on, where not much is happening aside clearing roads. So reconstruction is happening at a slower pace than expected. The second one has to do with the framework, more to do with the political and security framework. Who really provides security to people who come back? What are the claims? I mean, there are legal issues about claims and so on. That's also quite unresolved. The third set of issues has to do with many of the people who fled ISIS or lived in ISIS areas who can be discriminated against because there's no. The size of the problem is such that even if you had a perfect legal process to check who has really cooperated with ISIS and what is the punishment for that, and so sometimes there's mass punishment and there's discrimination against families that are of perhaps real ISIS fighters or suspected ISIS fighters, and sometimes not ISIS fighters. I mean, altogether. So that's another example. So that's on the one part. The other one, which has caught international attention for very valid reason, has to do with the plight of the Yazidis and others who also left the region around Sinjar and elsewhere. There too, reconstruction is not happening fast. I don't know if you saw, but there's a couple of documentaries that show the church is being renovated because there is a statement, but the rest is. Not really. I mean, Yazidis obviously not Christians, but Christians around the area in Nineveh and so on. Same thing with Yazidis. There's an issue. There's an issue of politics as well, right? There's distrust between communities, and this lack of trust hasn't been dealt with yet. Still talk to Yazidis who tell you we can't trust the Kurds because of what happened in 2014. They were supposed to ensure our security. They packed and left, and then ISIS showed up, and it was a disaster for us. So it's still some way to go. I would say the problem is less serious. That's probably not the right word, but less acute than, for instance, in Syria and elsewhere, where the obstacles to the return of IDPs and refugees are much higher. But in Iraq, I mean, it's an oil-rich country that has gotten a lot of international goodwill and attention, and still not happening at the pace that it should. So I suspect the problem is going to be with us and with those poor IDPs for some time.
Yes.
So here's Jonathan Shaw, ex-military, theoretically in charge of Basra in 2007. I stress theoretically. Thank you for this fascinating snapshot of where Iraq is now. It feeds actually my question, which is that if I can take you back to the question that we were meant to discuss this afternoon, which is the painful transition to stability, what we're seeing, what you've depicted is actually Iraq not being stable at all. In fact, you could argue it's almost getting worse. Why might that be? You mentioned political structures earlier on. There is an argument that says that the political structures imposed on Iraq after 2003 were not about stability, they were about justice. And if there's one legacy of Saddam's time, it was the destruction of trust within society in Iraq, and that's why this completely scattered political body that you show on your slides isn't able to harmonise because no one trusts each other and everyone's after themselves. If really Iraq wants to go for stability, we need to go back to Weber and his definition of a state, which is having a monopoly of violence. What you've clearly shown in your slide, excellent slide on the PMUs, is there is no monopoly of violence. It is split amongst everyone. How does Iraq get on the road to stability? How does it achieve a monopoly of power, except by having a new bushy mustachioed dictator with an even bigger stick, this time being Shia, not Sunni?
Does anyone have a preference for taking that question?
I'll take it, but Zainab will start.
No, you go first and then I'll chip in later. I definitely have my opinion.
I think yes, the monopoly of violence, you're right. But monopoly of violence has to be qualified. Saddam Hussein did have monopoly of violence, and it led to massive instability, because if you have monopoly of violence and you're using it without checks, without counter checks and balances within the system and so on, you get there, right? I mean, the strong men, no, at least in the Middle East, the way monopoly. Pardon?
Have you been to Iraq?
I have been.
Spoken to Iraqis?
Yes.
Yeah. Rather than come to me and say we'd rather have Saddam back.
Well, I certainly.
At least you knew where you were.
I get the sentiment.
Maybe
but
we're
it's
talking
not
to different people.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think it's yes. I rehear the sentiment. It's often out of a lot of pain, frustration, the losses of the past 16 years. No one will debate that. At the same time, let's be honest. Saddam did not lead to stability in Iraq for Iraqis or the region, right? We have this romantic notion, General Shah, about the strong man who's going to deliver and so on. More often than not, they fail. We've had this discussion over Libya and elsewhere. You tend to think strong men can actually deliver. I tend to actually be much more skeptical about this. I understand that political processes are really painful. They do lead to violence and so on. At the end of the day, a strong man with monopoly over violence and all the tools of the state can inflict a lot more damage on his society than even, societal rifts within societies. So let's keep this in mind. In this case, I agree. The political system in Iraq since 2003, especially in the constitution, has been contested. It has allowed political parties to vie within their own communities, to ignore each other. There hasn't been necessarily the level of cooperation and so on. It is quite tragic. Iraq, I often tell Iraqis, and especially back then, who say, "Oh, you the Lebanese, you've mentioned, you reach coexistence. What coexistence? The only thing you need to import from Lebanon is the food. It's the best in the region and the world, but not sure the political system."
Have you had dolma?
That's but the point. My point here in fight. He's the one that burned me earlier. He's the bigger guy. But my point is this: those systems can evolve only through these kinds of convulsions. I mean, what we see right now, right? It's the real question is: does this protest movement, does it have political legs? Will it be listened to by a variety of political actors? Very interestingly, Muqtada Sadr 10, 15 years ago was in one place, and today is a totally different place. I don't want to aggrandize his role. I'm not naive about this, but it's actually quite interesting that a number of political parties have felt in the past few years that they have to stand on issues and discuss issues. Again, it's not perfect. I do expect a lot more instability in Iraq, but there is also at least some on the political spectrum have matured politically. It's quite telling that Iraq, after the defeat of ISIS, we haven't seen this massive retribution. Don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of problems with how former ISIS fighters are suspected, or sometimes innocent ones have been dealt and so on, but we haven't seen this massive campaign of revenge. Perhaps the system does have the internal restraints that it needs to. We haven't seen, the PMUs have done a lot of bad things, but it's not as bad as some people said they would. So perhaps they are the internal restraints in Iraqi society and within the state on that one. Anyway, I think it's a long road, and we'll continue fighting that one for a long time.
We're agreed on that.
Zainab, do you have anything to add on that note?
Yeah, I mean, well, my parents lived through a portion of Saddam's rule, so I mean, I hear about it every day, and I definitely don't think it's something that people want to get back to. The violence experience is not just, physical, it's emotional, it's psychological, it's something that's incomparable. Anyway, whether the strong man is Sunni or Shia doesn't make a difference. His rule, yeah. Anyway, going off. The path to stability. I think actually the road to getting onto the path of stability itself is one that's difficult to kind of go through, and that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing kind of like Iraq's attempts at trying to get on this path of stability, and it's difficult, and there's a lot of violence involved in it, but they're trying. If you look at it as a whole, then yeah, it looks like they're not getting anywhere. But if you pay attention to the specifics, these protest movements are very promising. People are realizing, yeah, we deserve more, we deserve a functioning system, and we're not scared to go out and say it. That's the difference between now and then. Now people know what they want, and they have the right and ability to go out and say what they want, whereas before, that was unheard of. You even think about an opposition to the system and you're gone. So I think we're definitely making moves in the right direction, but again, things like this don't happen overnight. They don't even happen in a decade or two. It's a much longer, we'll see where we are in 20, 30 years' time, and then hopefully it'll be a more promising picture, but it's not something that we can expect. We can't have a 5-year plan for Iraq's stability, because that's useless.
The gentleman at the front, please.
Khalid Din, Citation Police Forum. What do you think is going to be the impact of the recent Turkish aggression against SPF? I mean, there's going to be seepage of ISIS fighters which are held. And are they going to flow into, it seems obvious to come towards Iraq, and will they reinforce ISIS in Iraq? So there could be a resurgence of ISIS. What is actually being done? I've been told, that there is SAS and special American forces operating in the region already. Do you think they're able to deal with it? And will the Iranian forces or Revolutionary Guard, will they come into this? Will the Iraqis ask them to deal with this issue?
Sure.
Just quickly on this issue. There are several elements there. We'll talk about the ISIS one in a second, and that's Zainab has done work on it. But there's an Iraq angle to that, which is that Turkey is intervening in northern Iraq, but a lot of people seem to not to follow that quickly. They're moving towards the Kandil Mountains. There's a lot of fighting there. The SEF, I prefer to call it YPG.
The mountains are where?
The Kandil Mountains.
Which is
in Iraq, in eastern Iraq, not far from the border with Iran, which is the basis of the PKK there. The point here is that the Turks are worried about their entire border. They've mounted a number of operations. This obviously is the most ambitious and will attract a lot of attention. I suspect it's going to be painful for the Turks, probably more painful than the Afrin operation in 2018. But in a way, without having to agree with what the Turks are doing, the way this whole debate has played out has only reinforced Turkish security perceptions. Now, on the issue of ISIS, yes, there is a risk of resurgence of ISIS, but ISIS is in places already resurgent. It's just that other issues occupy our mind. It's not resurgent in the way it was in 2013 and certainly not 2014. I still think that the monster that we will face, the ISIS 3.0, whatever, depending on how you categorize that, doesn't necessarily have the potency of previous incarnations, in part because Sunni communities have been massively scarred by this jihadi organization, so I don't think that there will be necessarily the kind of welcome or complacency or whatever, but it will be bad enough, to get our attention. There are several issues as well in terms of the fighters, right? There are large numbers of ISIS fighters, specific ISIS fighters in Iraq. There's also lots of them in Syria. There's a lot of them who have slipped and operating in quiet cells or just waiting for the right moment to emerge. These groups, jihadi organizations, thrive in times of chaos and when there are security vacuums. So I suspect they will also benefit from it. But again, we should be careful not to always see that in the prism of 2004. Of course, it's an important lesson. Not to be to underestimate the threat. It's just that there are so many more actors who have been engaged in the fight against ISIS, are keeping their eyes on and so on. So I don't think ISIS necessarily has a great advantage there. You say international special forces from the UK, US engage on the battlefield, the French and others. Yes, they are. But when the US announces that it will leave, it shifts the perceptions and the behavior of local allies. Who do they work with and so on? Look, fundamentally, there's no replacement to working with the US. They have air superiority, they have ISR, they have the muscle that's needed, and I still think that it's going to be very difficult to fend off this. In Syria, we have one problem. In Iraq, it's a different one. In Iraq, the government is requesting the presence of international partners. They need it. Their forces work alongside them. So I think they will be a careful monitoring of the situation. In Syria, I think the game is totally messed up, but it's been messed up for I would say at least since 2012-13, and the lack of interest in the political process in Syria in actually trying to get the big picture right only makes this harder. Essentially, every local and regional party is incentivized to make a stake in Syria at this point. And the Americans have decided that they're not interested or capable of affecting the balance of power in the northern Middle East. And so everyone's going to operate based on that. The Iranians, they see an opportunity, a threat on that. The Turks are rivals, but they're not enemies, but they're not partners either. The Russians look at that and they have to get everyone working together, but it's kind of difficult to get everyone working together. We're in business. What can I say?
I think Zainab had something to say, actually.
Just to add on Emil's comments on the ISIS issue, I just brought this map up here to show that the activity along the border is actually quite, existent. And the border itself, the Syria-Iraq border, isn't as solid as it should be and secure as it should be. So with reference to potential ISIS militants moving from Syria into Iraq, it is a possibility, but whether that would actually change things on the ground in terms of ISIS's activity, I don't think is the case. They would probably help the insurgency and assist in that way, but we're not seeing, as you said, we're not seeing an ISIS in 2014 where they're trying to hold territory or even take over any sort of areas, and they do lack the they do lack the kind of population support, and they don't really have the people on their side as they did before.
Put yourself one second, just 1 second, in the shoes of an ISIS strategist. I mean, at this point, your interest is much more Syria than Iraq, right? I mean, this is where the real chaos is. This is where the fragmentation on the ground exists, and so on. Don't get me wrong. Let's not be complacent. It may move to Iraq or elsewhere. But I mean, my concern right now is still Syria-centric when it comes to ISIS.
A gentleman at the back has had his hand up for a while.
Thank you very much for this talk. My name is Shayan. I'm a student at the LSE. My question was about the role of the religious scholars in the political process in Iraq. There was a brief mention of Grand Ayatollah.
Could you just speak up slightly?
My question was about the role of the Marja'iyya in Iraq's clerical establishment, and there was a particular mention of Sayyid Sistani's role with the PMUs. Can you hear a bit more about what their role is generally in the stability of Iraq and their vision of the future going forward?
Sure.
Shall I? Okay. The role of the Marja'iyya. So the Marja'iyya and the Hawza and Najaf, and particularly Sistani, they don't really take an active role in politics, but because of the nature of Iraqi politics and the kind of, religion and politics go hand in hand, and religion has a very big influence on culture and politics and life in Iraq. So a lot of people do turn to Sistani for kind of guidance. What should we think about this issue? What should we do about this issue? Sistani himself likes to, he's of the school of thought of kind of separating religion from politics, so he doesn't like to involve himself in political affairs. But obviously, when so many people are looking towards you and asking for your assistance, he sometimes speaks up and says, I agree with this or I agree with that. The popular mobilization units themselves, they only became a thing because of Sayyid Sistani's fatwa. So his influence is very big. And I think he knows that, and he's very careful with when he chooses to interject and when he chooses to speak on certain issues. As previously on the issue of the integration of the PMU, he didn't respond, positively or negatively. He didn't really say one way or another. But traditionally, we know that Sistani advocates for the integration of the PMUs into the state system, and the units within the PMUs that follow Sistani are mostly protecting the shrine cities, so Najaf, Karbala, Kadhimiya, and ensuring that those areas remain safe. Otherwise, they've always been open to integration or even disbanding. So, the role of Sistani has been the same along the years, and I think I'll end there.
We actually happen to have a question from someone tuned into the webinar, and the question is, do you anticipate an Iranian response to the likely Israeli strikes on the slide? So, Zainab,
well, not really. I don't think the Iranians have an interest or really the option to directly retaliate against the alleged Israeli strikes in Iraq. They haven't. They tried a couple of times to respond to the much greater strikes against Iranian sites in Syria, and it hasn't gone well for them because it's actually quite difficult. Israel has defenses. It's watching very closely this. It may be a delayed response. It may be a comprehensive response at a later stage in a greater conflict situation. But I don't think the Iranians have an interest in a tit for tat with Israel just because Israel does have military superiority and intelligence superiority on that. Even I would say the PMUs. Aside from the Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis declaration about the need for an air force, have tended to be, quite measured on this. The problem is that if you say one, it's Israel, and second, that you're going to strike, you're creating an expectation, and so it becomes a problem of credibility. Hezbollah and Bashar al-Assad and whatever can get away with it. They always say, we'll head back at a time of our choosing, and then you wait 5 years for something to happen. But they are immediate neighbors of Israel. It's in their face. So in Iraq, I would argue the political conditions, the presence of the Americans, the fact that the Iraqi government doesn't really want to get into this, an escalation as well, just prevent a direct retaliation. You also have to consider one thing. Iran's posture in the region is, first, it's being built up, so you have to decide whether you're going to risk it before you actually have everything you want, and it's you know how you're going to use it operationally in terms of doctrine and so on. The second point is that you also have to think about what is your more immediate interest. And at a time where Iran is trying to entrench its influence in certain countries and saying that perhaps is not the priority. They can suck it up in Syria, in Iraq, while they pursue what they think are more strategic priorities.
Cool, thank you. Because we have 5 minutes left, I'm going to take a round of 3 questions. 1, 2, and 3. Yes, introduce yourself.
A great meeting. Jonathan Paris, member of the IISS. Just to follow up on that excellent webinar question. I think the problem that the Israelis have is not so much with the PMUs, but the fact that Qasem Soleimani has figured out that he can franchise these SSMs, these surface-to-surface missiles that are incredibly precise. These cruise missiles that hit the Saudi refineries have really scared the Israelis. I've never seen them so scared. I've been watching them for 40 years, more. So this is good news for the Iranians, but it's also bad news, because this, combined with the American pullout of Syria, means that Israel's going to say, well, how many of these SSNs are we going to allow in Iraq to be used against us? Because if they can hit Saudi Arabia, they can also hit Israel from parts of Iraq. So this is the problem. How do you think the Iraqi government's going to control Qasem's apparent green light on building and warehousing these surface-to-surface missiles that can hit within 1 meter of their destination, all the way to the Mediterranean? Big problem.
Yes, second question, please.
Ali Arsalan Pasha, I'm an intern here at IISS West. My question is for Zainab. You mentioned that there is a diversity of opinion in the PMU whether they want to be associated with the Iraqi military or not. Is this merely an exercise of autonomy, or does Iran have an ideational influence in this narrative?
Thank you for that. And the final question.
Yeah, hi, Becca Shipley. Thank you all so much. I'm a senior change and policy advisor, but back in the day was an Islamic politics major. And I was more looking at the sociological side of it, if anyone wanted to comment on that. Obviously, the ISIS and the Daesh meant a huge amount of displaced people, and I would say that the Iraq that we know today is not the Iraq that we've always known, because there's still so many people that we don't know where they are, right, into the kind of the Turkmen contingency. What, if anything, do you think is going to be part of the kind of repatriation of these people? Is that an option? Do we see those people ever coming back? And how will that affect, like you said, we can't really have a 5-year development plan for Iraq, but how will that affect the development of the country going forward, considering it's definitely not got who it used to have?
Okay, so 3 questions. Iraqi reactions to missile warehouses in Iraq, diversity of views within the PMUs, and that relationship in terms of Iran and the Iraqi state, and the repatriation of people. So, who would like to address what and in what order?
Well, I'll take the PMU's question then. On the diversity of opinion, so I assume what you mean is basically, does Iran have any influence on the way in which the PMU think? Which I think would be giving far too much agency to Iran. Yes, they are supported and funded and advised by the Iranians, but they are also their own people, and they can make their own decisions based on their own kind of the way in which they think their interests are aligned. So Iran, for itself, would have the PMUs that it supports to be autonomous, so that it has its own stake within the Iraqi system, right? So that's what you would think, from an Iranian perspective, that's what they would want within the PMU. But as I said in the presentation, the reality is different, because even those units that are allied with Iran have often conflicted. So that shows the extent of Iran's influence, that, they will support them, but at the end of the day, they are their own people, and if they think otherwise, they are not afraid to go against Iran's kind of ideals.
So, Emil, in a whirlwind, 1 minute, Iraqi reaction to missile placements and purported missile placements and repatriation of people.
I mean, on missiles, this will conflict with what Zainab just did. When Iran is able to deploy strategic missile capabilities in a country next door, and possibly has a view to firing them to not the next country but the country after, then there is a relationship of command and control on some issues. It's true that the PMUs do diverge. They are clash of egos, of local agendas, of who gets what resources and so on. But I think strategically, at least the big ones are still would do what the Iranians want them to do, and Iran tolerates and manages the competition as long as it doesn't impede Iran's own interests. It's good to have a fallback option if one gets burned and others. So on the missile issue, I agree. I mean, I don't know what the Israelis are thinking, but what you're saying is, sounds logical to me. They do worry about, it's an increased missile threat. And by the way, it's a topic across the Middle East at this point. Who has ballistic missiles, who has cruise missiles, who has drones. Dia wrote about drones, other colleagues write about cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. We see that across the battlefield. So it's not unwarranted, and Israel is not the only country that will worry about this. If you're Saudi, you will worry about it. If you're Iraq, you may worry about it. But everyone is going to be worried about it. The difference is that Israel has a doctrine, it has air capabilities, and has intelligence capabilities to do something about it. Others can't really do that. They don't want to risk the escalation. They feel that they can manage such an escalation. And we saw that in the case of the Abqaiq attacks, right? Is that the Saudis don't really want it. They are worried about where this escalation would go. It's pretty clear that the Iranians were behind all that, but there are much bigger calculations behind that. I think the Israelis, the concept of Fortress Israel, dominates. You want to assert military dominance. You want to preempt the building of capabilities whenever you can, and they're doing that. It's going to be a big question in terms of Iraqi sovereignty if there are strategic capabilities on Iraqi soil that the Iraqi government doesn't control. It's one thing to have militias run around and do their thing and extort people and set up their checkpoints and so on. It's a different thing when you have another country with positioning on your soil. So just as the Iraqi officials should be really concerned about the US using Iraq against Iran, Iraqi officials will be asked not to allow their country to pose a threat to another one. A very uncomfortable situation to be in. Return of IDPs and saying, look, the Middle East lives, there are IDPs and refugees a bit everywhere. It has become a feature of modern-day Middle East. It's very difficult to create the right conditions to bring them back. I think getting the political security incentives right, when there's no reassertion of a strong but just state, to do that is very difficult. Very little trust. I tend to be. I think it's not very popular to say that, but these are often problems to be managed over a long term. You can't necessarily have a resolution or some silver bullet for that. In a number of cases, I think you will have communities simply disappearing. Christians in Iraq, Yazidis, and whatever, they may decide that they'll never see reconstruction. They don't have a strong political voice in Baghdad and elsewhere to get the kind of money for reconstruction, the security guarantees they need, and so on, and say, we're out. That's it. Other communities have done so in Syria and elsewhere in the region. It's heartbreaking.
On that note, I'd just like to bring to everyone's attention two upcoming events that we're having at the IISS. The first one is tomorrow on what territory means for African jihadists. We'll be looking at the finance, control and recruitment within these organizations. And on Wednesday, 23rd of October, we are launching our Africa sessions, and we will be opening with a discussion with the Kenyan ambassador to the UK. So we hope to see you at our future events. The email is behind us should you have any questions. Thank you very much.